This video is Unit 9, Human Systems, Learning Targets 14 through 18, Circulatory, Lymphatic, and Respiratory Systems. First, for the circulatory system. Primary parts of the circulatory system are your heart, obviously, your blood vessels, and your blood. Let's work through these. And what is the function of your circulatory system? It is to send oxygen and nutrients to all the parts of the body and to take CO2 away from the body. Here's your blood. It is filled with lots of fun red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and plasma. Erythrocytes, or this is just a fancy word for red blood cells, or RBCs. These carry oxygen and get rid of CO2 as well. They have a special protein in them called hemoglobin, and that hemoglobin has an iron, actually has 4 iron molecules. Hemoglobin is a 4-part protein, and each one has a little iron molecule on it. And those iron atoms then hold the oxygen and transfer it to the blood, or throughout the rest of the body. Lymphocytes are another word for white blood cells, and lymphocytes fight infection. They fight off foreign objects in the blood. We'll talk more about that when we do the immune system. Platelets, these aid in clotting, and you can see how they're shaped rather oddly. This helps them to clog up holes. There's a protein in your blood called fibrin, and this fibrin clogs up the particular, like if you have a wound or something, you can see here it forms like a net, and the platelets stick themselves in the net, causing it to clog up, which forms a scab. Now here's a picture of your heart. A few words that are associated with the heart. There is the atriums. Atriums are the small chambers of your heart. I'll draw them here. Right atrium, left atrium. And then the ventricles are the larger portions of your heart. The ventricles, the atriums basically pump blood into the ventricles, and the ventricles pump blood away from the heart, which we'll talk about shortly. There is the atrium, ventricle. There's the aorta, and the aorta is this large artery that feeds out of the left ventricle that pumps body to the head and to the rest of the body. And a couple more words, arteries and veins, which we'll talk about in a second. But anytime you see the word pulmonary, this has to do with the lungs, either going to the lungs or coming away from the lungs. The myocardium is the muscle of the heart. And see, another word here is is vena cava, and vena cava is just a big vein, similar to the aorta as far as its size. All right, your heart also has a pacemaker in it. It's a sinoatrial node, and the pacemaker essentially keeps your heart in rhythm. Someone who has a heart who doesn't stay in what's called sinus rhythm, then they have to have an artificial pacemaker put in, just looks like this, and it basically trains your heart to beat correctly because your pacemaker doesn't work the way that it should. Inside the circulatory system are what's called valves, and a valve, this is a blood vessel here. A valve might look like this, and what happens, let me draw that a little better. What happens with the valves is blood can go one way, but it can't go the other. And so, let's see if I can get this to work. So if blood attempts to come in the blood vessel this way, then the valves will just simply open up and let it through. But if it attempts to go through the other way, the valves will close, preventing blood from going through. So it only allows the passage of blood one way. It keeps blood from flowing backwards, which allows the circulatory system to be very efficient. The circulatory system is also made of blood vessels. You have three types of blood vessels. You have arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries are very thick because this is the vessel that pumps blood away from the heart. Artery starts with an A, and so does away. So that's a good way to remember it. And then the blood goes into the capillary beds, which capillaries, this is where gas exchange happens. And so they're really thin, usually only one cell thick, and they usually only allow one blood cell at a time through. And this is where gas exchange happens. This is where waste is put off as well. And you can see this is purple because it usually denotes that oxygen is being left. And the veins are usually colored blue because there's no oxygen left, because a vein is where the blood is coming back to the heart. Veins have valves in them, as you can see here, and the valves, I have another slide for that. The valves keep blood from flowing backwards. You have big veins that come up from your feet, for instance, as the blood is coming back from your feet to the heart, and you're standing. Of course, if blood was allowed to flow backwards, then your feet would constantly have blood in them. And so this allows blood to flow in one direction. You have two circuits or cycles in your circulatory system. One of them is called the pulmonary circuit, and this has to do with the lungs. This is where the blood goes to the lungs, gets oxygen, and comes back to the heart. That is one loop. And after that, it makes a second loop, which is called the systemic circuit, or the systemic system. And this is where it goes to the head, to the rest of the body, and then back to the heart. Now, what is the pathway that this blood takes? Let's start here, the pulmonary system. And we're going to start in the, that shows up good, in the right atrium. You could start anywhere because it makes a cycle. So the right atrium, from the right atrium, it goes into the right ventricle. And the right ventricle is the smaller of the two ventricles because it's only pumping blood to the lungs, and it's going to pump blood to the lungs through the pulmonary artery. So it's going this way, that way, to the pulmonary artery, and it's headed to the lungs. One common misconception is that arteries always have oxygen, veins do not. Arteries always go away from the heart. Veins always come back to the heart. And so in this case, the blood that's going away from the heart has no oxygen in it. So it's going to the lungs. So the lungs are 4. And then from there, it comes through back through the pulmonary veins. And those pulmonary veins are now full of oxygen, and they feed into the left atrium, which feeds directly into the left ventricle. Now from the left ventricle, the blood goes into this giant vein, the aorta. Now we're in the systemic system here. So here's the aorta. Choose a different color, aorta. And now it's going to go out to the body, whether it be the head or the rest of the body. And it comes back, goes out, gets rid of its oxygen, goes into the capillary beds here, and goes back. And this is where you have your vena cavas, and those both feed back into the right atrium. Here is all that in a nice, neat, written down form. So you can pause the video if you need to do this. This is something you need to be able to recite to me. Circulatory system, also again, capillary beds. You can see here, this is a pretty good picture showing the capillary beds. Shows the little smooth muscles that are surrounding the capillaries in order to keep them intact, and also push the oxygen through them, or the blood through them. And you can see this is where gas exchange is occurring, which we'll mention gas exchange when we get to the respiratory system. Lastly, on the circulatory system is this idea of blood pressure. Blood pressure is important because you need enough pressure in your veins and arteries in order to get blood from the heart to the rest of the body and back to the heart. Too much blood pressure does damage to your vessels and damage to your heart. Too little and you don't get enough blood flowing. So one of the ways your body regulates blood pressure is by regulating the amount of water that you have. If you're dehydrated, you're a lot less or more likely to have lower blood pressure, and so your body will retain water. All right, the lymphatic system, it's its own system, but it's also kind of part of the circulatory system. There's a um, substance that kind of flows through your body, and it's called, surprisingly, lymph. And lymph is essentially excess blood plasma that is put out into the surfaces of the body. The lymphatic system is an open circulatory system, and it comes out, goes out into the body, and comes back. And as it's going through these lymphatic tubes here, it goes into these lymph nodes, which you've all heard of lymph nodes before, because sometimes they get swollen. Why do they get swollen? Because lymph carries with it lots of infections that are in your body, and it gets into the lymph nodes as a way of filtering out those infections, and they can become infected and swollen if you're sick. And so the lymphatic system mainly serves to fight infection in your body and gathers excess blood plasma. Respiratory system. Function of the respiratory system is to deliver oxygen to the body's tissues and to carry waste away from the body's tissues. Several parts of the respiratory system, you see them listed here. You have the pharynx and the larynx. I'll mention those in a second. The trachea, which is your windpipe. Bronchi, which is the tubes that go into your lungs, of course your lungs. And then you have a muscle under here called the diaphragm, or diaphragm is how you say it. I say phragm, helps me spell it. And the diaphragm is a muscle underneath your lungs that helps you to breathe, actually causes you to breathe. Now, what is the pharynx? The pharynx is this passageway behind the nose and the mouth, and it's a common area for those, both your nose and your mouth. The larynx is actually your voice box, is a common word for that. And you can see your vocal cords here, these white structures here, and they stretch over your voice box, and when you breathe over them, they make sound, which is what talking is, or any sound that we make. If you have laryngitis, you have an infection of your vocal cords, and that's what causes you to not be able to speak as well. Bronchi are these tubes that you see here in the brown down here, and they're just tubes that lead into the lungs. Usually have some cartilage on them to protect them. And if you've had bronchitis, then you've had an infection in these tubes, which usually causes you to cough. I put this picture of cellular respiration to make sure you understand a few things. First of all, we're not talking about cellular respiration. We talk about the respiration of the body, but we are talking about taking in oxygen, which of course cellular respiration requires. Remember, cellular respiration, O2 is the final electron acceptor, and so oxygen is needed. Why? So that this process, cellular respiration, which is important to make these things, ATP, can be made. ATP, why is it important? Well, it does everything. Now, how does breathing work? Breathing is an involuntary action, however, you can control it, which we'll talk about in a second. But breathing works with your diaphragm. Your diaphragm is this red band here that I've now made black. And the red band basically contracts, causes it to push down or pull down. Think of a plunger. And that pulling down causes you to open your mouth and breathe in, or breathe in through your nose. It basically creates like what we call negative pressure. Well, then when it pushes up, it's similar to you like pushing something through a tube, except for this time all the air that's in your lungs gets pushed out and you exhale. All right. And so breathing is an involuntary action that is caused by the contraction and release of your diaphragm. However, breathing is something that you can control. Thankfully, it's not something we have to control. We have a special part of our brainstem called the medulla oblongata. It makes sure that we are breathing. That's not its only function, but that's one of its functions. And when we go to sleep or when we're not thinking about breathing, we are still breathing. because the medulla oblongata makes sure that we are getting sufficient amount of oxygen, getting rid of sufficient amount of CO2, and doing that at the correct level, which is why, for instance, if you go outside, you're going to run around the track a few times, you start to breathe hard because your medulla oblongata is saying, you know what, we need more oxygen than we used to have. And so that's why you breathe hard. I thought I had a different picture, but I don't. You can also control your breathing. You can control the rate at which you breathe, which is important in some endeavors. And so this is something that we have control over, but ultimately, if you decide, for instance, that you're just going to hold your breath indefinitely like a child, then you'll eventually pass out and your body will take over and cause you to breathe. All right, in your lungs, there are special structures called alveoli, and these are tiny little sacs. Your lungs kind of shaped like this. You actually have 4 chambers to your lungs, but we're just going to draw them simple. And instead of just being 2 giant sacs, they are filled with these tiny little sacs. Each one of them is surrounded completely by blood vessels. Here's a good picture of this. And so as you take in oxygen, each one of these little sacs is going to fill up completely with O2. And the other gases that you breathe in, of course, but there's O2 in there, which is what your body is concerned about. Now, how does the O2 get into your blood vessels? You see the blue vessels coming, they're desperate for some oxygen. Well, somehow they get it because they're turned red before they leave. That happens through diffusion. So here is the capillary, and of course these ovals are the red blood cells. And this is the lung cell, or the alveoli. There is more oxygen in the lung than there is in the red blood cell, and so particles move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Well, there's more CO2 in the red blood cell than there is in the lung, so the same thing happens. And so now your red blood cells are full of oxygen and your lungs are full of CO2. And so you breathe that in, your vessels fill up with oxygen. Now your lungs are full of CO2 and you breathe out and you're exhaling CO2. There's another picture of that same idea. It's not as good. I chose this picture because it shows what's going on in the body cells as well. Because the same thing is happening in the body cells, except for it's the opposite. The red blood cell is now giving oxygen to the body cell and taking CO2 from the body cell through diffusion. The same idea. Particles move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Now, real quickly, this just shows you the composition of inhaled air versus exhaled air, and I think it's interesting to know that the air that we breathe in is about 21% oxygen and only 0.04% of carbon dioxide. But the air that we breathe out, still we breathe out a lot of oxygen, so our bodies aren't altogether efficient. But we breathe out 400 times more CO2 than we actually breathed in, which is a pretty efficient system.